Mena Watch, der unabhängige Nahost Think Tank.
Dear viewers, welcome to this edition of Mena Watch Talks. This time it's about an unpleasant topic. It's about the worldwide wave of anti-Semitism and this madness that has been happening in countless demonstrations in many cities in Western Europe, in the USA, and so on, since the October 7th, 2023 massacre. In debates concerning what constitutes the ideological foundations of this current wave, the keyword postcolonialism is frequently mentioned. And to gain a clearer understanding of what exactly is meant by this term, postcolonialism, we have invited someone who is exceptionally qualified to elaborate on the subject. Ingo Elbe is a research associate and private lecturer at the Institute of Philosophy at the University of Oldenburg. He has already produced numerous publications throughout his distinguished career. His most recent book, and one that is particularly significant for us in this specific discussion, is titled Anti-Semitism and Postcolonial Theory, The Progressive Attack on Israel, Judaism, and Holocaust Remembrance. It has already been released in its second edition in Berlin. So first and foremost, dear Ingo, thank you very much for taking the time to be here to answer our questions. A brief preliminary note, we've known each other for several years, which is why we're on a first-name basis. And we'll keep it that way in this conversation for simplicity's sake, so it doesn't come across as artificial. So, postcolonialism. Let's start from the very beginning with a very general question. What exactly is postcolonialism? What should one imagine it to be?
Yes, so postcolonial theory asserts the continued existence of colonial mindsets and societal structures, even following the formal decolonization which occurred approximately in the 1950s and 1960s. Its primary aim is to detect these lingering effects. No, the fundamental thesis posits that there is a continuity of colonial thought patterns in the West and of colonial societal structures. And depending on the particular variant of postcolonial theory, these patterns can sometimes be 2,500 years old. Like with Edward Said, for instance, from Aeschylus to Karl Marx, or even 500 years old, as with these so-called decolonial theorists from Latin America. So that's the core concept, that the West, primarily indeed, the focus is almost exclusively on the so-called West, which is always referred to in such a generalized manner, continues to perpetuate colonial patterns of thought and behavior. That's why it's called postcolonialism, meaning it continues after formal colonialism. That's the thesis.
Now, as I mentioned, it's often discussed in relation to these demonstrations and the anti-Semitic wave following the October 7th, 2023 massacre. There is evidently some type of, more or less direct connection between such post-colonial theories and this, well, I can't describe it otherwise, Israel hatred and partly anti-Semitically charged Israel hatred that is now emerging. So to start, let me ask, are all post-colonial theories, so to speak, affected by this, or do some also exist in a sensible form? Is there a post-colonialism that doesn't manifest in anti-Semitism and Israel hatred?
Well, first of all, it's a globally widespread movement, one must point out, and it's become very influential in many universities by now. And you can, of course, say that many post-colonial theorists are initially concerned with completely different topics. That means you won't find much there on the topic of Israel or anti-Semitism. However, it can be stated that those who do express their views, and an increasing number of these post-colonial theorists are doing so, a significant percentage of them demonize Israel and exhibit relatively consistent thought patterns. While this is true, there remain a handful of post-colonial thinkers. Theorists who view it with more nuance, but they don't command significant standing. They aren't truly prominent or influential within this specific domain. And the most prominent figures are indeed representatives who demonize Israel at the very least. Yes.
That basically started with the theorist who is considered the, well, you could say the ideological or intellectual father of post-colonialism, Edward Said and his book Orientalism, right?
Yes. So this book, as you mentioned, is from 1978 and is, if you will, the foundational work or one of the foundational and grounding works of this way of thinking. And in it, you can already find many of the characteristic problems of this approach, which, by the way, I also see beyond the issue of anti-Semitism in Israel. However, his fundamental premise, for instance, asserts that the West, as he terms it, forges its identity and establishes its existence within history by setting itself apart from a disparaged, fabricated other. This phenomenon was subsequently dubbed othering. And this other in his context refers to what he calls the Orient, which he views as an imperial construct by the West. By defining the Orient, the West then positions itself as progressive, individualistic, and rational, while portraying the Orient as backward, collectivistic, irrational, and inherently needing to be governed. That is the fundamental thesis and the critical problem here. And this then becomes, so to speak, the defining characteristic of post-colonial theory. Said essentially employs this framework of thought as a template, applying it specifically to the issue of anti-Semitism and subsequently to Israel, which in turn entails various inherent problems. Well, the very first problem is that one of the primary issues is that he draws no true distinction between anti-Semitism and racism, specifically racism targeting Arabs. He even postulates that anti-Semitism is actually anti-Semitism, specifically the hostility of the Christian Western world against both Jews and Arabs alike. And the subsequent assertion is that fundamentally, after Israel's establishment, the Jewish people, in essence, aligned themselves with the white ruling class, and that Arabs and Muslims today are, in effect, the modern-day equivalent of the Jews. And the second step is in his 1979 book, The Question of Palestine. He explicitly posits the thesis that Israel was established upon the elimination of Palestinians as a people, specifically the theoretical and practical elimination of the Palestinian people. And this second thesis then became stylistically influential for a subcurrent within post-colonial studies, specifically the settler colonialism studies.
Yes, that's a central point, and you emphasize it time and again that when genocide is mentioned by so many sides in the context of the Gaza war or the war against Hamas, one must always keep in mind that they mean genocide in a much broader sense. It's not about the thousands of Palestinians who have died. Instead, the mere existence of Israel as a Jewish state is by definition viewed as an act of genocide according to this theory.
Yeah, exactly. So this concept of genocide, it goes back to Palestinian nationalist thinkers, partly from the 60s, but was then elaborated on in these settler colonialism studies by representatives like Patrick Wolf or Lorenzo Veracini, who are two leading figures. And exactly, genocide isn't merely the physical elimination of a group as a collective, meaning as a people intended for elimination, as a people or a culture. Rather, all manner of practices from an ostensible or actual settler society are deemed genocidal because it essentially asserts what one might call an archaic natural right of an original indigenous people to claim that land. And so, any collective settlement from external forces is essentially an act of genocide because it would lead to the destruction of that society. And just to give some examples of what Patrick Wolf includes under the term genocide. Thus, he claims, for instance, that beyond physical elimination, of course, the granting of citizenship is also deemed genocide, or the state's promotion of mixed-race marriages is similarly regarded as genocide. Lorenzo Veracini, in one of his books, actually enumerated 26 different forms of what he calls eliminatory transferism, which is essentially genocide and displacement. And things like travel reports from Europeans who discover some tribes in Africa and then say, yes, they have political organization methods like the Swiss, are also included. Such sentences are also considered quasi-genocidal because the specificity of this clan is then covered over with European categories. Indeed, this term is quite inflationary, and it operates with very strange, almost archaic, if you will, blood and soil assumptions. It suggests the existence of an aboriginal and primitive community that subsequently faces destruction. It also doesn't matter what political form of organization this community has, That is completely irrelevant, and that is mostly disregarded, especially when it comes to the Palestinians, it is disregarded. It's irrelevant if it was a patriarchal clan structure back then at the beginning of the 20th century. That doesn't matter to these supposedly progressive theorists. And a second crucial aspect, of course, is that regarding Israel, all possible means must be employed to deny the indigeneity of Jews within this particular region. And there is, if you will, an entire theoretical industry within these settler colonialism studies that attempts to assert this with preposterous theories. They claim that Jews are not indigenous, but that Palestinians are indigenous. Lorenzo Veracini, one of the two leading figures, says, for example, that the Palestinians have an ontological relationship to their land. So in philosophy, ontological means pertaining to being and its principles. So they are somehow deeply intertwined, having essentially grown together with the land. Meanwhile, the Jewish people are perceived to have only a historical relationship to the land of Israel, which is therefore considered less legitimate. So these theories actually work with such outlandish constructions.
And that's where it connects to an older left-wing anti-imperialism from people from times when it was always said that Israel is a Zionist entity or whatever, not a real state, unlike states truly connected by blood and soil. So there are definitely ideological continuities there.
Yes, precisely. The triumph of this perspective naturally lies in the fact that this settler colonialism theory, this entire postcolonialism, can effectively link with the simplistic Manichean good versus evil patterns found in traditional left-wing anti-imperialism. And it's there that the transitions truly become seamless and fluid. This is a kind of, if you will, the new, more postmodern-oriented left and the old, more Marxist-Leninist-oriented left can find common ground on this. Israel is the colonizer, the Palestinians are the original people who are being exploited and annihilated.
So in this context, you speak of systematic theoretical distortions that arise when this principle of coloniality, which is constantly being discussed, is applied to Jews, to Zionism, to anti-Semitism, and to the Shoah. You're highlighting a few points there that I would now like to go through them one by one, so to speak, in order to create a clearer picture and understanding. The first point is that there isn't really any anti-Semitism, or at least anti-Semitism definitely doesn't mean what people commonly understand it to be.
Yes, precisely. As I've already mentioned, Said's argument begins with the assertion that anti-Semitism is merely the animosity of the Christian West directed at Semitic peoples, understood in terms of their linguistic origin. And many post-colonial theorists today strongly align themselves with that idea. Of course, that's where we already have a central problem. Things like anti-Arab racism and anti-Semitism naturally produce very different enemy images, which Said simply ignores, and his successors often ignore as well. Yes, anti-Semitism accuses Jews of being hyper-modern, suggesting they pull the strings behind all stock market crashes, wars, and crises of every kind. In essence, they are considered too modern for their own good. Whereas Arabs or Muslims in anti-Arab racism are accused of being primitive and pre-modern. And sometimes they're not even accused of this. In fact, the radical nationalist right in Europe is even somewhat envious of the imagined Islam they envision, wishing it possessed those traits of being collectivistic, heroic, masculine, and warlike. So the attributes ascribed to Arabs and Jews are entirely distinct and different. That's something that gets overlooked here, and it's also a fundamental issue with this post-colonial perspective. It attempts to squeeze all phenomena into this singular framework of colonialism. In traditional colonialism, colonized populations were frequently accused of being backward, thereby necessitating governance by their colonizers. But when it comes to Judaism and anti-Semitism, this simply doesn't fit the picture, because anti-Semitism imagines itself fighting against those above, against the supposedly ruling class. And in a way, they are considered superior, or at least smart, cunning, and connected to the mechanisms of modernity and abstractions. And that's the exact opposite of classic colonial attributions, right? So, on one hand, the Jew is hypermodern, while the Arab is pre-modern. And these differences are not recognized. Indeed, they are sometimes even reproduced within post-colonial theories themselves. Thus, it's asserted, as Said himself previously implied, that until 1945, Jews were perhaps considered less than white, as is occasionally suggested, and experienced racial oppression. However, with the establishment of Israel or their advancement within societal structures, they subsequently became white or infiltrated the core of Western mechanisms of dominance, a notion championed by Enzo Traverso. And this reproduces, or at least is amenable to, classic anti-Semitic patterns of the privileged ruling Jew. So that is a primary and central problematic point here. What does it result in when the Holocaust is being discussed?
Well, the Holocaust, at least as it has been perceived and understood since the 1970s, become somewhat widely accepted, is a crime that simply isn't just like many others. Rather, it truly is a singular or unprecedented crime. Postcolonial theorists see that completely differently, I assume.
Yes, exactly. So this schematic or Schablon thinking is then also extended to the Holocaust. Anyone who has no concept of anti-Semitism cannot develop a concept of the Holocaust either. And there are various attempts to interpret the Holocaust as a colonial crime committed by white people against other white people or against those who are not entirely white due to racial discrimination. To understand discriminated Jews, this is, in essence, the fundamental thesis. The Holocaust is just one variation of a colonial crime, and as such, it completely lacks any unique specificity. And indeed, if one proceeds from the idea of the Holocaust as a singular or unprecedented crime, then one might well ask, why is the Holocaust unprecedented? This is because it aimed for the complete worldwide and redemptive anti-Semitically motivated extermination of all individuals marked as Jews, and it pursued this aim with relentless consistency. And this was entirely independent of any geopolitical, economic, or demographic criteria of rationality when it came to population policy. Therefore, it wasn't the case that Jewish people had a territory which the Nazis intended to conquer and incorporate, or that the primary goal was to exploit the Jewish population. No, they were to be annihilated, specifically the Jews of the German Reich. They were targeted for annihilation because they were regarded as the puppet masters behind all the internal conflicts within modern societies. And if you were to eliminate the Jews, these conflicts would cease, and a supposedly natural order of peoples and races would be re-established. That was the core belief. And that is something completely different from colonialism, where there were also large-scale extermination campaigns. Let's take the example of the Herero and Nama in German Southwest Africa, which figures like Jürgen Zimmerer always interpret as a precursor, almost as a path to Auschwitz. And even there, historians like Jonas Kreinbaum, for example, have shown that extermination camps never existed. And above all, even in the case of General von Trotter, who gave this extermination order against the Herero in 1904, that even this, which was dieser General von Trotter, der 1904 diesen Vernichtungsbefehl gegen die Herero gegeben hat, later revoked by the German Kaiser, that even this extermination order itself occurred within the context of an actual colonial war. This means the Herero fought back against their colonization. They mounted an uprising against the Germans, and it was in the midst of this war, this militant conflict for both territory and labor, that the extermination order was then formulated. There is nothing comparable to this in the Holocaust. There wasn't a Jewish partisan army first, which then, so to speak, provoked a German intention to exterminate in response. No, that intention was there from the beginning. These represent several profound and fundamental differences between the Holocaust and colonial crimes. And when this is pointed out, it's often dismissed as splitting hairs, or this particular specificity is simply not recognized. There are various theoretical traditions that are drawn upon here, including some rather adventurous ones that directly link to Said. For example, it is then claimed that Jews were murdered as Muslims in Auschwitz. Gil Anijar, the post-colonial theorist, asserts this point because of the strange word Musulman, which was the camp jargon used in Auschwitz to describe the emaciated prisoners. And then, from this word, a semantic content of Muslim is conjured up. So, these are the most adventurous stories that take place there. Precisely. But here, an attempt is being made to explain away the unique nature of the Holocaust. Then, the Holocaust is simply subsumed into the extensive tradition and vast history of Western colonial crimes. Perhaps it's a slightly more extreme mass murder than the others, but nothing more.
And invariably, this is coupled with the assertion that the remembrance of the Holocaust ought to be relegated to the background on the grounds that it obscures or pushes aside the memory of other atrocities perpetrated elsewhere, I have genuinely never been able to grasp why this argument holds any weight. Why should the act of commemorating the Holocaust necessarily lead to the memory of other colonial crimes being completely overlooked or disregarded?
Exactly, and that already shows that's one of the basic theses of this so-called multidirectional memory from Michael Rothberg and others. This already reveals the political thrust of this entire discourse, because there is absolutely nothing objectionable about remembering the colonial crimes committed by the West. Just a brief parenthetical remark here. However, one shouldn't exclusively focus on Western colonial crimes, but also those of non-Western societies. And there, post-colonial thought already presents a major issue. Indeed, it possesses a significant blind spot regarding non-Western societies in that particular aspect. I characterize this as negative Eurocentrism. One tends to focus exclusively on the transgressions committed by the West, essentially advocating the theory that Western nations are solely responsible for all the world's problems. While topics such as Islamic slavery or similar matters aren't examined at all or are at best given minimal attention. So that is essentially the first point. And the direction that this is going in is naturally clear. To say, well, the Holocaust overshadows everything here, especially in Germany, the US, and Israel. And I would also say that the political motivation of this whole discourse, as the historian Sibylle Steinbacher has very aptly noted, is actually always anti-Israeli. The argument essentially suggests that if the Holocaust wasn't a uniquely heinous or distinctive crime, then Israel isn't needed as a special state to protect Jews, because that historical continuity supposedly doesn't actually exist. On the contrary, many proponents classify Israel as a colonial state in the Holocaust's tradition. That is a central point. And perhaps there's another important aspect that also needs to be taken into consideration. This idea of colonial amnesia, where the West, so to speak, has forgotten its own colonial crimes or that they are not discussed, I now also consider to be a purely strategic argument, because if one looks at museums, or indeed at the educators in our universities and in wider public discussions, it becomes quite clear that colonial crimes are very much a topic of discussion, particularly in the West and across many societies. One cannot simply appear after 2 decades and assert that this issue isn't being discussed, or that it's being overshadowed by Holocaust remembrance. I actually consider that quite adventurous to claim.
Yes, a colleague named Jan Gerber, who not long ago released a book addressing the evolving memory or the relativization of Holocaust remembrance, highlighted that numerous German universities now offer absolutely no courses pertaining to the Holocaust. So this idea that the Holocaust is the only thing being discussed everywhere and other topics are ignored is simply one that has little to do with reality. But that's just a side note. You've touched upon this several times, but when applied to Israel, this line of reasoning consistently leads to the conclusion that Israel is simply the greatest evil in the world and must be portrayed as a colonial crime, and so on and so forth. That has little to do with real history, but it is, so to speak, a necessary result of this approach to thinking.
Exactly. So this progresses through different avenues and various means. But one path is, of course, this colonialism thesis, combined with the thesis that the Jews have become white, and therefore they are white colonizers. Another perspective, of course, is the general delegitimization of Zionism, portraying it as an ethnic nationalism, and it's argued that ethnic nationalism itself brought about the Holocaust. In that sense, Zionism is considered the heir to this way of thinking. Some even claim it was, in a way, the precursor. So, when Patrick Wolf speaks about Zionists desiring to create Gentile-free zones, we encounter the notion that they essentially aimed to establish Jew-free areas even prior to the Nazis having already conceived this very idea. And depending on the degree of radicalism of the respective thinker, it sometimes goes so far to describe Zionism as Hitlerism, which is what the South American decolonial theorist Ramon Grossfogel, who taught at Berkeley, actually claims, he speaks of Hitlerism, with which Jews are now persecuting Palestinians. That is a consequence of this schematic application of this thinking to Israel, because they don't take the Holocaust seriously, because they don't take anti-Semitism seriously. And moreover, because Arab and Islamic anti-Semitism is not taken seriously, because the threat, which entails, first and foremost, the persecution and discrimination of Jews within Islamic-dominated societies, is typically entirely dismissed by clinging to this myth of peaceful coexistence. So, until the Zionists came, everything was supposedly fine, or until the Western countries arrived, everything was peaceful. And only then, supposedly, would an antagonism between Jews and Arabs have arisen. That's quite a fantastical assertion and bears no relation to actual history. But that is a significant, even pivotal legend, because it's essentially claimed that Zionism, as alleged colonialism, is the underlying cause of anti-Semitism found within Arab or Islamic societies. This legend, in fact, is encountered among nearly all theoreticians from the postcolonial sphere who address this particular topic.
You mentioned a specific South American theorist, and I find a particular quote from him incredibly insightful, so impactful, in fact, that you often include it in your publications. It clearly demonstrates how the hatred towards Israel, or indeed the animosity directed at Zionism, truly manifests and overshadows everything else. Culminates in a type of redemptive anti-Zionism, akin to what one might call the redemptive anti-Semitism of the Nazis. I'd like to quickly read this passage because it truly is very succinct and to the point. He penned these words regarding the current war against Hamas, stating, "We are truly in a profoundly spiritual and messianic moment. Either we get ourselves organized and bring an end to this injustice, that is the war, or we will inevitably advance toward the destruction of life on planet Earth." And he further states, "The liberation of Palestine will support the struggle for the affirmation of life. The Palestinian victory will elevate humanity to a higher level of consciousness." So this entire concept, this notion of Israel as the embodiment of evil, takes on deeply religious eschatological dimensions. Yes, most definitely. Well, when I read that, it was published in early 2024 on an Islamist homepage or an Islamic homepage, something like that. And that instantly reminded me of passages from Hitler's Mein Kampf, where he also wrote, if the Jew triumphs over the peoples of this world, then the earth will again be a barren rock gliding through the universe and so on.
And he also defends himself against Judaism in the name of the Creator and the Almighty, of Providence. Indeed, these similarities are truly terrifying to behold. Here, Israel-Palestine becomes the very center, virtually, of the universe, or at least of the entire world. And if a victory is achieved there, then humanity will once again move in harmony, and whatever else will happen. And that, of course, is classic anti-Semitism, which is now simply being projected onto Israel. And the fanaticism behind it, we have to realize this Grossvogel is not just a minor figure. He's one of the most influential decolonial theorists in the world. So it's a kind of undercurrent or a variation of post-colonial thinking. And when such statements originate from individuals of that caliber, then one hardly knows what to say. It becomes, so to speak, it becomes very clear that we may be dealing with an anti-Semitic motivation here, because that is precisely the idea in anti-Semitism. The Jews need to be exterminated, and then the world will find its salvation, won't it? That is the ultimate consequence of anti-Semitism, which the National Socialists also put into practice. And when that phenomenon reappears, specifically concerning Israel, then it becomes equally irrational and perilous. When such individuals teach at universities and spread their ideology to young students, essentially telling them that we are currently embroiled in such an apocalyptic end-time battle, what do you expect will become of these students if they genuinely internalize such beliefs? This is, in effect, a direct incitement to terror. I genuinely can't interpret it any differently. And even though it's not a widespread phenomenon yet, there have already been terrorist attacks and murders of Jews and Zionists in the USA, explicitly originating from these radical left-wing factions. It's indeed quite dire.
Right after the Hamas massacre on October 7th, there were social media posts from, post-colonial activists who wrote something along the lines of regarding the Hamas atrocities. Well, what did you think decolonization was supposed to mean? So they explicitly place it within that tradition. And say, yes, that's exactly what we meant, and it should be celebrated in that sense.
Yes, precisely. This is what also became the rallying cry at those university encampments. Decolonization is not a metaphor. Isn't that right? And that refers to a particular text published in 2012 by two notable decolonial theorists, Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, who very explicitly state that, well, true decolonization entails indigenous people reclaiming their land. And that follows what they call an ethics of incommensurability. So the settlers and indigenous people cannot be measured by the same standard, morally speaking. And what happens to the settlers is solely entrusted to the future sovereignty of the reclaiming indigenous people, yes, and they will never be equal. That's the thesis, right? And that's where the open dehumanization of the alleged settlers explicitly comes into play. And if one is in this line of thinking, right, that any means are justified against them, against these supposed settlers, then we arrive at social media posts that declare, yeah, you know, that's just how it is. Decolonization isn't some mere knitting circle, right? We may not condone it, but it's understandable and it's a legitimate means to drive the people out. And that ideology is incredibly widespread, reaching even Columbia professors, you know. Joseph Massad, he celebrated this Hamas attack, you know, and many other similar actions coming from that specific faction. This means we're also experiencing an extreme coarsening of the discourse here. And that's not by chance. Instead, it represents, so to speak, a consistent working through of the inherent possibilities within this framework of thought, I would argue. That doesn't mean every post-colonial thinker thinks this way, but the potential is inherent in the discourse, and these representatives are consistently thinking it through to its conclusion.
Toward the end of our conversation, I'd like to return to the beginning in a certain respect, namely Edward Said. After his book Orientalism was published in the late 70s, numerous academic colleagues demonstrated that it simply contained vast amounts of factual errors and claims that were utterly outrageous, with significant internal inconsistencies, self-contradictions. Thus, everything that needed to be said is, essentially, that after such strong criticisms, a book of that nature should really be considered finished as a respected work. And yet, based on what we've just discussed, we now see the consequences it leads to, the forms of modern barbarity one has to admit that it can bring forth, and in some cases already does. So the crucial question in all of this is, why is it so successful? So why do so many people adhere to these post-colonial aberrations, these post-colonial delusions? Why is it gaining such widespread acceptance? Why does it seem at least that our universities, especially in the Western world, are on the verge of being completely taken over by this way of thinking? Why has it become so successful?
That's a very good question. I can only speculate on it. Well, the first point is, of course, that it is legitimate to critically examine Western colonialism. However, I don't really need post-colonial theory to do that. One should state very clearly that there exists both colonialism research and colonialism critique that does not necessarily need to operate within the frameworks that Said employed. However, the crucial point is that this approach inherently offers a promise of, at the very least, a degree of absolution from culpability, primarily achieved by continually assuming perpetual responsibility for one's own perceived wrongdoings, don't you think? Adam Kirch described this very well in his book on settler colonialism. You know this idea, yes, the West is to blame for, so to speak, many colonial crimes. That's something that, by expressing it as a so-called Westerner, in quotation marks, generates a certain, not necessarily redemption, but rather a definite sense of moral pride, wouldn't you agree? I'm superior to other uncritical Westerners, even if it has no impact on my actions towards alleged indigenous people or victims of colonialism, right? The Palestinians themselves don't gain anything from it. There's no real positive outcome for them from this global wave of sympathy, you know? Rather, they are affirmed in these destructive patterns of thought. Yet that's perhaps one aspect to consider, isn't it? And certainly it represents a very simplistic mode of thinking, prevalent even in Said's own writings, meaning it's this idea that the West is the perpetrator and what is later called the Global South is the victim. And it's the same in Said's work. The Zionists are the perpetrators and the Palestinians are the victims. This truly represents a very simple Manichean good versus evil scheme. And it's a rather straightforward way of thinking. And it promises, well, to at least somehow manage to contain that feeling of guilt, That, I believe, is one significant point. A second crucial point to consider is that it was not by chance that this book was written and then achieved such significant success, particularly during the late 1970s. This implies that the left, not solely the radical left, but mainly that faction at some point could no longer put their faith in the Marxism-Leninism of the Eastern Bloc and its promises, thus they searched for an alternative to their worldview. And the great thing about this post-colonial thinking was that it allowed people to essentially continue their anti-imperialism, identifying Western societies as exploitative and preying on third world nations, then merely shifting this viewpoint into a more postmodern or literary studies approach. This thinking was then transferred, and then, with Said and especially with his successors, another factor came into play. They became culturally sensitive, as I would put it somewhat ironically. This means that, while not everyone, many people are now embracing cultural relativism. It doesn't matter what kind of organizational power structures these cultures internally possess, they must be preserved and safeguarded from the Western exploiter, destroyer, and eliminator. This cultural sensitivity, which then naturally progresses into cultural relativism, has become quite a pervasive and dominant idea in today's world. Outwardly, it naturally presents itself as a gesture of tolerance and, it makes one appear sophisticated and accepting of others. De facto, what this implies, and it's a notion found in many, many post-colonial theories, though not all, is that people then start talking about, for instance, Chinese human rights, Russian human rights, or even Islamic democracy. It explicitly affirms these authoritarian or totalitarian power structures simply because they are not Western. With Butler and company, you're familiar with the idea that Hezbollah and Hamas are supposedly part of the global progressive left. Or, for instance, Walter Mignolo and Grossvogel, who assert that entities like Iran and the Houthis. Grossvogel even calls the Houthis the axis of good, the axis of life itself, are legitimate. You see, those are precisely the alliances that form between what is supposedly a progressive left and Islamists or authoritarian societies. And that is the final point that I could provide as an indicator of its widespread impact and enduring success. Well, it is indeed a fact that the bipolar world order, or the transient unipolar world order with the United States as the hegemon, no longer holds sway. Instead, we are actually witnessing the emergence of a multipolar world order characterized by prominent regional power blocs such as Russia, China, and Iran, to name a few. And so if I have a theory that affirms this, then that, so to speak, then that has a basis in reality, doesn't it? It's really the case that these are becoming major powers, more or less, which are also challenging the West. And in that sense, this discourse accurately reflects reality, even if it is, of course, uncritical of this rise. So those would be various motives where I would say this can explain why it is so successful. But for me, of course, it can't explain why an entire academic field, at least large parts of the humanities, fall for it so uncritically. It's truly shocking, and one must speak of the suicide of the West, especially in academia, given what's happening. And one that is also very explicit, already with Said, right? He was then heavily criticized, as you said. The book is full of methodological errors and contradictions. He completely ignores entire traditions of Orientalism that do not fit into his thesis and so forth. And then he just says, in the afterword, he declares, well, I'm taking the liberty to claim a right to inconsistency, right? A right to inconsistency for a supposedly good political cause. And that already shows this activist primacy in this way of thinking, doesn't it? It's about striving to create a better world, and so at times one takes the liberty, which occasionally becomes apparent within these texts, to simply reinterpret the world, to reframe it slightly, and consequently to reevaluate the Holocaust, for instance, in order to forge a significant anti-racist alliance against national racist West. And I believe that this is also very attractive to people who feel they need to do something, and then that activism is activated.
You say quite rightly that in a way it represents a very straightforward mode of thought, or rather a way of thinking that adheres to extremely simple patterns. I might add, and that's true of course, but given the jargon-laden conceptual clatter that accompanies it, it is anything but simple to read. Indeed, it is truly unbearable to read these texts, purely from the perspective of the language and the constant, ceaseless repetition of specific formulas. Thus, considering all this, what they produce is far from being simple.
That's correct, yes. This is also linked to the fact that postmodern thought, ranging from Derrida to Foucault to Nietzsche, played a pivotal role in this culturalist shift within the anti-imperialist left. It's also true that sometimes complexities are indeed highlighted, for instance, with this concept of hybridity, meaning there are no longer just pure indigenous identities, but rather they blend with Western ones and so forth. All of that already exists. But ultimately, it really just comes down to us having one very straightforward message, doesn't it? For me, these settler colonialism studies are the epitome of what comes out of it. So that suddenly one starts working with concepts of indigeneity. And this is my thesis, which are then openly susceptible to anti-Semitism, right? On one side, we find the culture-destroying, individualistic, hyper-rational, rapacious, materialistic West, and on the other, the community and nature-connected indigenous peoples who are subsequently destroyed by this very West. And here we have what can also be considered an Occidentalist perspective, a view of the West that amounts to an essentialist condemnation of it as inherently evil. And when you observe that, you might ask, what were the consistent accusations leveled against Jews within modern anti-Semitism? They were accused of being eternal wanderers, destructive individualists, and self-centered exploiters who ruin cultures and peoples. This means that through this irrationalist condemnation of the West, one that goes far beyond simply criticizing Western colonialism, we are essentially creating an open flank for anti-Semitic stereotypes. Well, there we have, so to speak, an inherent theoretical connection that is created. You don't have to go down this path, not even as a post-colonial theorist, but it's a potential that is inherent in the theory itself. And here I'd also like to explicitly defend myself against Sebastian Conrad, who recently penned a rather weak text, in my view, in Mercure. It was on this topic in defense of post-colonial studies, where he asserts that there's never any systematic effort made to demonstrate the inherent theoretical connection between anti-Semitism and post-colonialism. Thoughts. I believe he can't have read my book. He quotes half a sentence and that's it, because that's what I try to show in the entire book. These aren't just random individual missteps. Curiously, they emanate from the world's most prominent proponents of this ideology, not from fringe elements. It's an inherent potential woven into its very fabric, and if one is determined to uphold this mode of thought, then it must undergo fundamental self-critical introspection. Reform itself, and I really don't see any potential for that. Especially after October 7th, within all the ongoing feuilleton debates, I'm observing what seems to be nothing more than a purely defensive strategy. They deny, they downplay, they attempt with the most outlandish methods to demonstrate that these accusations are baseless, and that is not a proper course of action. Above all, it's not a good sign for a supposedly self-critical left, that the criticism is completely, not taken on board at all and is simply ignored or reinterpreted. And that's unfortunately what's happening. Of course, you can understand it too. These individuals have built their entire careers and sometimes their very identities upon this ideology. However, this perspective should at minimum evolve differently among students. Yet I remain doubtful. I believe that even in Germany, we haven't even reached the peak of this thinking's influence yet. Its influence will probably increase in the coming years.
With that not exactly optimistic outlook, we can conclude our discussion. We can also conclude our conversation. Dear Ingo, many thanks for making the time to join us. I think it was a very insightful, just under half an hour, 45 minutes. So, thank you very much to you, Ingo, and to all of you, dear viewers. Just a quick note, we'll try to include at least some of the books Ingo mentioned during our conversation in the description of this video on YouTube in case you're interested in exploring them further and delving deeper into the topics discussed. Otherwise, as always at this juncture, if you found this video enjoyable, we kindly ask you to consider giving us a like or even subscribing to our channel. Like oder ein Abonnement bei uns dabei herausschauen. That of course significantly benefits us in our engagement with the YouTube algorithm. Algorithmus deutlich weiter. Otherwise, thank you very much for your attention and see you next time. Und bis zum nächsten Mal.
Mena Watch, der unabhängige Nahost Think Tank. Besuchen Sie auch unsere Website. Dort finden Sie täglich neue aktuelle Berichte und ausführliche wissenschaftlich fundierte Hintergrundanalysen zur Geschichte und Gegenwart der MENA-Region.